And that's why the trail markers are so important, to remind us how important these people were, and that's why we had a civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement in Mississippi is the most important part. There were some civil rights workers early in the 60s that said, if we can change Mississippi, we can change everything. But if we can't do Mississippi, the rest of it don't matter. So this is how important the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement is. And I think it's also important that we know the individuals who made it possible, who did things in our communities. You know, I can think of people whose names I can't even remember, who took such chances, but they put their lives on the line and they fought for them. Now, let me give you an overview. I'm one of the younger people in the civil rights movement, and I'm pretty old. My hats have to really go off to people who were active in 63 and 64 and 62. That was a dangerous, dangerous time, and you didn't have really anyone to go to or anybody to call. These are people we have to honor and appreciate. You know, we had Mrs. Hamer, who was probably the most famous person in Sunflower County, but there were other people too, Charles McLaurin, and people who kept the civil rights movement going, or people who sparked it or kept things, you know, organizing. It was so true here at Bena. I remember Bud McGee, when I was working with legal services, we had different things where we'd intersect and work on things, because like most civil rights workers, he continued doing stuff on into the 70s. So honoring the early history of the civil rights movement was very important. And again, the church was so important. Without the black church, there would have been no civil rights movement. That was the backbone of the civil rights movement in Mississippi. And almost every leader in the early movement was a very strong church member. And the people who ran the churches, they were taking major chances too. I mean, sometimes in Sunflower, in the town of Indianola, we couldn't get a church because you marked your church for violence. And we had some burning over in Indianola. So it was a project of the parts that were in the civil rights movement, or buildings that were part of the civil rights movement. You had to stay up all night and guard those places. So, nonviolence aside, we had a gun, and we stayed and watched certain church or whatever building you were using for civil rights activity. Of course, if you had a gun, you didn't have to use them, because me and a gun was not very dangerous. But anyway, we all took turns doing that. The last time I saw Marion Barry, he was playing poker with Lawrence Guillot. But this was a person too that we could, you know, that we need to lift up and talk about. He worked through some horrible health problems, and to look at him, you would never know it. He was so busy and so active. And part of the people who in the civil rights movement who tore their health down, you know, they were working with eating crummy food and walking the streets doing civil rights work. They had a hard time keeping up with their health. I'm trying to think if there's some other things I can bring to give you a picture of what Mississippi looked like in the early 60s or even into the 70s. This was something that always amazed me. Doctors' offices were all segregated. And with very few exceptions, you could tell immediately. They didn't need a sign. You could walk in there and you could tell which was the black waiting room and which was the white waiting room. And those were the last things to give that up. You know, bus stations and other places had to take that away. But doctors' offices, they took their time. So I can remember going to doctors' offices here, or going in them. I didn't go to the doctors here much, where there were 2 waiting rooms. And it didn't matter if the black room filled up and the white room was empty. That's where you had to go. So I appreciate that that you're honoring this church that took its chance and stuck its neck out and was like a foundation of the civil rights movement for LaFleur County. And I also want to thank Valley State. My 2 grandchildren graduated from there. All right, and again, I think that keeping this history and telling this history, we're dying. I'm pretty old, and a lot of the people who I started out with the civil rights veterans, they're not here anymore. You know, June Johnson is gone. Travis, a lot of people who were in the civil rights movement in Greenwood, they're not here anymore. So, and I can imagine that, the same thing with Itta, Bena, that a lot of people who can tell you how it was, they're not here. But to honor them and appreciate their bravery and what they went through, that you have my congratulations.
Thank you so very much.